Welcome back and welcome to part C of module 1. In this video we are going to talk about the evolution of highways in the United States. First, let's do some recap. We talked earlier a healthy transportation sector is essential for healthy economy, and transportation sector creates tens of millions of jobs. And we also talked about the transportation system, its components and various modes, and a comparative assessment of each mode in terms of freight, passenger transport, and safety. So contemplate this. True or false? All interstate highways are freeways, but not all freeways are interstates. Think about that. While you are contemplating answer for that question, also imagine United States without the interstate highway system. Imagine no further. Here's how the highway map looked like in 1955. There is no interstate. For those of you who are watching who belong to the millennial generation and you can't even imagine a life without a smartphone, it's funny, not too long ago, the smartphone, this class, students of this class, only about 1/3 of you have a smartphone, and it's very likely all 100% of you have a smartphone today. You can't even imagine a life without the smartphone. Now imagine life without interstate highway system. And that is such a powerful part of our lives, the interstate highways. It's known as the greatest public works project in the history, not just in the history of the United States, in the history of the world. And President Eisenhower championed it, and that's why he's called father of the interstate highway system, which we are going to talk about the legislation that led to interstate highway system in this short bit. But for now, what an interstate system is, it connects two or more states. It is called interstate highway system. That doesn't include a bypass around a city. It is structured in many ways, from funding to numbering. We will talk about funding a little later, but numbering is, here's an interesting trivia about numbering. If you look at this, you go from left to right. Highways that go north to south are odd numbers. And if it is a multiple of 5, like 5, 10, 25, like that, they tend to cross multiple states, especially from almost north to south. Route 5, Route 95, these are all, they're almost north to south. Similarly, of course, the numbers increase from left to right. Similarly, going west to east or east to west, whichever way you want to call it, start at number 10 in the southernmost part, and they go all the way to 90 at the northernmost part. And if you have a multiple of 10, 20, like that, they tend to cross all multiple states again. So there are some exceptions, but this is generally how the numbering system has come about for interstate highway system. So earlier we looked at this particular chart. So I also said, remember this, over 160,000 miles of national highway system, and also ask you to remember Highway Trust Fund, which we are going to talk a little bit detail in this video. Here are some statistics about highway network in the United States. There are about 4 million miles of highway, of which nearly 47,000 miles are of interstate highways. I should warn you here a little bit. These numbers may not exactly match the numbers I have presented earlier, because they may correspond to different time periods. And it's enough if you remember the approximate numbers. So for instance, you see 46,873 miles of interstate. If you say around 47,000, that's good enough remembrance. You don't have to remember to the exact mile. Also, the ones in the boxes are more important, like this one, and also this particular numbers you should have some idea about. So if you travel along interstates of these 47,000 miles of interstate at 60 miles per hour for 14 hours a day, you need 55 days to cover them all, the entire stretch of interstate highways in US. So, and then there are 115,000 nearly miles of other highways in the National Highway System, which is NHS. So the total NHS, which includes non-interstate and interstate, is about 160,000 miles, a little over that. And the rest of them are about 3.8 million other highways. And if you travel them at 40 miles per hour for 14 hours a day, you will need 7,100 days or 19 years to complete this entire stretch of highways in the United States. That's how extensive highway network in the United States is, which means that not every road is traveled as heavily as, say, for instance, I-95, but that's the extent of travel. And also, when you're talking about engineering, this is the extent of demand for your engineering services. So that's the reason to present this particular information to you. So what is National Highway System? These are the roadways that have been deemed important to our nation's economy, defense, and mobility. The system includes Eisenhower Interstate Highway System as well as Strategic Highway Network, major strategic highway network connectors, intermodal connectors, and other principal arterials. As they say, a picture is worth more than 1,000 words. Today, the National Highway System looks something like this. In blue is Eisenhower Interstate Highway System, and in red are other major highways. NHS may be only about 160,000 miles, but their importance is far greater than their share of the mileage. This chart tells you the real importance of NHS. In terms of route miles, NHS is only 4% of all roads in US, and the percent share of NHS in lane miles is higher than that. It's about 6.7%. But look at the usage of NHS. Over 44% of all vehicle miles traveled in US are on NHS. To say the least, it is very, very impressive, isn't it? And that's why NHS is important, very important. Earlier I asked you to ponder a question. Is it true or false? All interstate highways are freeways, but not all freeways are interstates. And what's the answer to that? It's true. Freeway is a functional class, and all interstates are freeways built out of a congressional act. So that's the difference between a freeway and an interstate highway. The highway system of hierarchy is defined in the form of a functional classification in the so-called Green Book. The official title of the Green Book, which you have to know verbatim, is A Policy on Geometric Design of Highways and Streets. Why do we call it a strict definition? Because there are legal and financial, by that I mean funding ramification for these definitions. And the 5 functional classifications are: freeways or expressways at the top, followed by major arterials, minor arterials, collectors, and lastly local streets. One more time, you should know the exact title of the book verbatim: A Policy on Geometric Design of Highways and Streets. If you recall the definition of transportation system, we talked about a few keywords: mobility and access. Mobility and access are the main basis for this functional classification. At the high end, you have the highest mobility for freeways. At the low end, the highest access for local streets. And on the screen are the actual definitions of each one of these categories. Arterials, of course, which includes both major and minor arterials. You have major collector, minor collector, and local streets. So these are the strict definitions you can find in the Green Book. Again, what's the name of it? It's A Policy on Geometric Design of Highways and Streets. While we're on the subject of roadway classification, you should also know that all interstates are built to freeway standards. One more question for you to think about. What's the difference between a freeway and an expressway? So here's the difference between expressway and freeway. On an expressway, you will find some at grade intersections, signal controlled or otherwise, like the one on the left. On a freeway, you do not find anything at grade intersection. Everything is grade separated. If you want to take an exit to another street, you either have to take a ramp and go up, or you take a ramp and go down to the local street. And that's a freeway standard. Giving you an example, Fairfax County Parkway here locally is an expressway where you will find signals along it in some places. On the other hand, I-66 is a freeway. Here's another administrative hierarchy of highways as per Federal Highways Administration. FHWA stands for Federal Highways Administration. All roads are either rural or urban, and within rural you have arterials, collectors, and locals. The same kind of split happens between urban and rural, arterial, collectors, and locals. And you have within arterials you have principal arterial and minor arterials, major collectors, minor collectors, and it's fairly straightforward to remember if you put it in this hierarchical chart or flow chart, if you will. Let us switch gears and think for a moment. What would be the state of mobility and the economy in the United States of America without this? Hard to imagine, isn't it? It's worthwhile our time to take a moment to recap how we got here, meaning how the nation's highway system got so good. Let's take a road trip on the long road to the Great American Road. In 1775, the highway network looked something like this, and that changed drastically 25 years later to look something like this. And let's take a look at the statistics in the 1800s, how long it took to go from one place to the other. 1800s. That's the time well before the railroad and in the era of the stagecoach. And the travel time from New York City to Pittsburgh in the year 1800, it's 2 weeks. And in 1830, it dramatically improved to 1 week. Detroit from 4 weeks to 2 weeks. St. Louis from 5 to 2.5 weeks. Very well. Today it takes 6 hours to Pittsburgh, 10 hours to Detroit, and 15.5 hours to St. Louis. What a remarkable change in 200 years. So what did it take to get from here to here, and from here to here, and from here to here? And the answer is a lot of political will, without which none of this would have been possible. So what's the major takeaway from all of this? Policy is the key for infrastructure development. In the context of evolution of highways, we need to study a little bit of legislative history of modern highways in USA. Why study legislative history? First of all, it all begins with policy. Without policy and money set aside, you can't build anything. Then you do planning. Planning leads to preliminary engineering, which then leads to engineering, and then presumably everybody lives happily ever after. Since this is not a history class, we cannot obviously talk about a lot of history here, but we will talk about a few key legislations that led to the development of interstate highway system and then strengthened the national highway system network. So the first one is Federal Road Act of 1916, which is the first of its kind, and the purpose of it is to improve rural roads. And $75 million was allocated for 5 years. Monies were distributed to states on the basis of population, area, and mileage of rural roads. States are required to give 50% of the project cost, and federal government would give the other 50%. And then in 1944, a key legislation was passed, and it is called Federal Aid Highway Act of 1944, and it designated for the first time National System of Interstate Highways. The word interstate highways was used in 1944, but the problem is the legislation did not authorize any funding to build it, this interstate highway system. And this is long before President Eisenhower became the president. The largest peacetime public works program in the history of the world started with this legislation, Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. Although the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1944 authorized designation of National System of Interstate Highways, Congress did not give any money to build it. President Eisenhower made revitalization of the nation's highways one of his goals in the first term, and he pushed for interstate highway systems. There is some history to it. As an Army Lieutenant Colonel in 1919, Eisenhower had accompanied a military convoy across the United States and saw the poor condition of our nation's roads. Later, during World War II, when he was serving a stint in war in Germany, he has developed he admired Germany's well-engineered Autobahn highway network, and it reinforced his belief that the United States needed first-class roads. As a result, Eisenhower formed an internal committee to study the idea, enlisted the nation's governors to offer suggestions, and met with members of Congress to promote the proposal. When legislation failed in 1955, imagine that, it first failed, interstate highway system legislation failed in 55. Observers then predicted that, presidential election year of 1956, the Democratic Congress would not approve such a significant plan sought by the Republican presidents. Nevertheless, what happened is President Eisenhower continued to urge approval and worked with the Congress to reach compromises that made approval possible. The President signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 on June 29, 1956. It's very important as a transportation engineer for me. And this is, again, it is an understatement to say the biggest peacetime public works program in the history of the world. Or another largest peacetime public works program, you call it. And it authorized 41,000 miles of nation's system of interstate and defense highways. So that's then why you see the shield on highways. And original budget was about $24.825 billion as of July 1st, 1956. The program was to end in June 30th, 1969. Federal funds were made available on a 90-10 matching basis. If you remember, in 1916, it was 50-50 basis. Now, federal funds are 90% and 10% state funds. So, by 1995, we have 45,500 miles completed with total cost approximately $329 billion. And in 2015, there are about 47,000 miles of interstate highways in the United States. Impressive. So earlier we talked about the 1944 Federal Aid Highway Act did not provide any monies, set aside any monies for development of the interstate highway system. How did they resolve this in 1956 Act? Title 2 of the 1956 Act provided a revenue source, and this revenue source is by levying taxes on gasoline at the pump. So if you are pumping gasoline, at that time you're going to pay some tax, and that goes into a fund called Highway Trust Fund. This Highway Trust Fund is to be set aside separately from the general fund. The general fund being the personal income taxes, the corporate taxes. They are used for other purposes, but Highway Trust Fund has to be used only for highway, for building interstate highway system. At the time this fund was established. Later it was, the use of it is expanded, but only for transportation purposes. Currently, Highway Trust Fund is in a state of disarray, and there is an intense debate going on in Congress, and there is controversy associated with it. And you're going to look more into highway trust fund controversy, or not controversy, the debate on highway trust fund, and that's part of your exercise you're going to do for this module. So current federal gasoline tax, which is the money from which is going to go to the highway trust fund, is 18.4 cents per gallon. This was done in early 1991, early 90s. As a matter of fact, this is the gas tax that cost, this is the tax that cost senior President Bush, George H.W. Bush, his presidency, and he did not get reelected because he went on with this gasoline tax hike. And since that time, nobody would dare touch increasing this gasoline tax. That's something you will do a research and then find out the debate on gasoline tax. Then the highest, on top of the federal gas tax, the states are allowed to put their own tax. The highest state tax is in Pennsylvania. It's about 50.5 cents per gallon. This also includes excise tax. And the lowest is, of course, you would have guessed, it's Alaska, 8 cents per gallon. And what is Virginia? You're going to find out. And what is Maryland? You're going to find out on your own. Let us summarize what we learned in this video. We learned to differentiate between freeways and interstates. We learned to draw mobility versus access illustration. We learned to list all functional classes of highways in their hierarchy. We can outline national highway system and its importance. We can recap the evolution of highways in USA, and we can outline key provisions of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, especially the Highway Trust Fund component of this act. These summary points are important for your, they play into your learning objectives, and therefore you can expect to be tested on these points.